Hello there. How are you today? Normally I would light this in front of you, but this is actually a relight. And normally I wouldn't put ice in a glass like this, but that's what I had available. So, what do they say? We're doing it live, except for this is a recording, so even my analogies are failing. Oh well. What can you expect? So anyway, I've already begun this cigar, so I don't know how much time I have. But I don't think I need a ton of time, at least to approach the subject matter. Um, I've noticed it's become popular um, for, content creators to discuss dating and the current landscape, between men and women and all of this. And, as someone who's either been in relationships for long periods of time or somebody who is, currently single, I have both of those qualifiers. I can say that things have changed in the dating market. That is true. Things have indeed changed. Um, but I have to confess that even though people are talking about the changes, I don't particularly feel that um, I'm seeing the accurate diagnosis out there in the wild. The views that I see being expressed to me don't appear to track very well onto reality. Not how it looks to me anyway. And so I thought, well, why not talk about it some? Um, I've been observing the dating landscape and even participating in it. Um, I've tried dating apps, and those are okay at getting dates and things like that. But I understand some of the concerns people have. Maybe the ways that dating apps cause people to view themselves may not track very well onto reality, or perhaps they fuel narcissism and things like that. Give people a sense of self-importance and confidence that may or may not be grounded in reality. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the issues are with dating apps, but they do appear to be there. There are issues, or at least ostensibly it looks that way. And so the question then is, what's the real issue? Like, where's the real issue coming from? Is it the app, or is it the user base? I'm just going to keep lighting matches. I don't know why I'm just going to keep lighting matches. We'll get there eventually. Matches are definitely not really the way to go with a big 6x60 ring gauge cigar. Definitely not what I would recommend using for a cigar this big. These kinds of cigars didn't really popularize until more recent times, and by then we already had torch flame and all that. So yeah, I think we're going okay now. So anyway, so what gives? What's the issue? Is there a cultural issue? Is there a generational gap? Why is it that young people are having such a hard time dating as times change? And what, if anything, can be done about it? These are good questions. So, um, not only are they good questions, but they're questions which I don't see any particular answer that I'm compelled by out in the ethos. So, figure I'd weigh in and give my 2 cents on a few of these subjects. So, um, we have to lay the groundwork for some of the possible issues, or some of the issues, at least as I see them. And one of the issues is that over half of Gen Z men are not only not in relationships, but not even looking for a relationship. This has really never been the case before, that young men aren't even looking for a relationship. And there's a lot of potential reasons why. And I generally think of people as pretty smart. And so, you know, there's probably a reason for that. What that suggests to me is that the incentive structures that exist are not favoring men going and finding a relationship. They're not favoring a young man going and approaching a girl and trying to get into a relationship with her. If the incentive structure was good, young men would be doing it. And so, what that means is that if more than half of young men are not searching for a relationship, the most likely explanation for that is that what they're getting from relationships isn't worth pursuing. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, as they say. I think I've finally corrected the cigar. We'll see. This would be the kind of problem that a nation wouldn't be able to survive if it wasn't solved. Because of collapsing birth rates and the issues that come with that, which are both economic, cultural, and philosophical in nature, and potentially even theological. It depends on what level of analysis you want to go to, but all of those issues are potentially the right level of analysis. And so, some people might just say, well, these kids aren't dating anymore. And I would say, no, this is a topic of national security, so to speak. This is a crisis of meaning. This is an existential threat. And it's something that should be taken very seriously. Young people not dating is the end of the world, so to speak. And so, we have to take it seriously. We have to talk about it seriously. So, why are the incentive structures not there? What's been happening? Well, this is a question that I'm probably not going to get into on today's video too much. I think that people have their reasons for not dating, both men and women. I think people are having a hard time doing what they should do and doing what's best for them. I think historically it would be fair to say that one of the driving factors in a lot of young men's lives and history has been the promise of a wife and kids. I think maybe from a values perspective, young people aren't so keen on the idea of kids. I think a lot of people have been convinced that kids are too expensive, that they can't afford them. Whether that's true or not, I personally think it's probably not true. I think probably you could afford kids if you had them, and I think you would maybe figure out how to afford them on the fly. I think that's probably what a lot of people do is they have the kids and then they figure out how to make life work afterwards. And that's probably been a pretty common approach in history. A little bit of a burn issue in the cigar, but that's okay. And matches are not the best tool to solve that kind of problem, but here we go. Some smoke hanging out on the microphone. And so the incentive structures for having kids in the first place, either they're not understood or they're not there. I think in this case, this is downstream from another values and epistemology and philosophical question. The question is more like, what's the purpose of life? It's that kind of question. We're not going to go there today. But I do think that that's probably where the origin of this problem really exists and really lies. So this video is going to be somewhat incomplete, but for the sake of brevity, we're going to gloss past that problem. But I think that the general summary is that people don't think that children are necessary anymore. They think that they're an option, and many people are not convinced by the proposition of the value in having them. That is to say, they think that they're just going to choose not to have kids, and that's going to be okay. I'm highly dubious of that proposition. I think it's not going to be okay if you don't have kids, but we'll just move on for the sake of the video. In addition, and perhaps as a consequence of this view that we just described, that then leads into the question of, well, if kids are not the objective of this relationship, then what is the point of it? Well, by its very nature, it would have to make your life better in order to participate in it. Otherwise, what's the point? And the reality of relationships is they're not always fun, right? Those of us who have been through a lot of them know that. They're not always fun. They're not always enjoyable. And without the end goal of family being the thing that makes the sacrifice worth it, I'm not exactly sure how a person would justify the hard times of relationship, of which there are many. Inevitably, there are always hard times in a relationship. I'm not sure how a young person would justify going through those hard times. And indeed, I think you can tell by the fact that people aren't looking for relationships and they're not staying in them. They don't. They don't answer that question. They don't justify the relationships. They just leave them. And this is happening irrespective of whether the commitment and the vows were marriage level, engagement level, boyfriend and girlfriend, or even just casually dating. We have a culture in which the habit or the common routine or the most common outcome is we're just going to break up. And I could be cynical about that, but I think the reality is if you're not planning to have kids and, you're not planning on having this family that you're committed to, it does seem kind of silly to struggle with somebody through hard times. I mean, what would be the glue that would hold you to somebody if you're not happy with them? And what's crazy is that because this culture has become so accepted that now even people who are in relationships where there are kids, they're talking the way that I just described. They're saying things like, if you're not feeling fulfilled, if you're not feeling happy in this relationship, you should leave it, right? So now even the people with kids are talking this way, like they're just going to leave if they're incontent. But I think it started with people who weren't planning to have kids. This cigar is giving me a hard time. We'll get there eventually. Matches really are not the right tool for this. It's okay. We're doing it live. Sometimes cigars don't have an even burn on one side. They canoe a little bit, and I'm fighting that the whole way down. So, when the solution is to break up, if there's a hardship, then you come to the point where let's assume that both parties equally employ that solution, just to break up if there's a hard time. Well, now we have to look at the dating landscape. Who's expected to apply effort? Who's expected to chase? Who's expected to pay for dates? Who's expected to do all of these things? To invest the effort, to engage their energy, to make the sacrifices to make the pursuit happen. Well, we all know the answer to that. It's young men. or any men for that matter. It's men. In the majority of cases, even if a woman has a career, there's a certain stigma around a man who's not going to pay for the first date or even for most of the dates. Um, it's a layover of traditional values, you could say. I'm not critiquing that. I'm not saying that men shouldn't pay for their first dates or for all of their dates. I personally pay for all dates. Um, I have no issue with that. That's not what I'm critiquing. Again, this is analysis, not prescription. I'm not telling anybody what to do. I'm not saying that there's anything even wrong with men paying on the dates. But when you analyze the incentive structure, you say, okay, one of the things that ladies typically get, particularly attractive ladies, from the dating landscape is that men will pay for most of the things. It's common. People refer to this as traditional dating or traditional values in dating. And to some extent, that's true. Okay. And because of that, because of these understandings, I think that probably most men would derive a sense of self respect from doing it. They could feel pride in themselves from being able to do that. And more power to them. I actually tend to agree with that. The question, of course, is when we go back to what I was just talking about before, which is that when you're in this circumstance where you're maybe not convinced that you want to have children, for example, um, or you know that your partner or your potential partners, their solution to circumstances or stresses or traumas in the relationship is possibly or even probably going to be just to break up. And you know this, and it's not even a question of if, it's just that's what happens in most cases, right? Well, like I said at the beginning of the video, most people aren't stupid. Even if they don't have this cognitively understood in their mind, it will be sort of implicitly understood in the subconscious level. I'm going to fight with this thing the whole way down, aren't I? I'm losing wrapper too. I'm not sure what to do about it. So people are going to have an kind of an intrinsic or implicit understanding of this problem. These young men are going to know that they're going to invest their time and their money. They're going to chase these women. And if they ever do anything that makes them feel upset or misunderstood or, not taken care of, the most likely solution that these young ladies are going to employ is to break up with them. Doesn't matter how much they've invested, doesn't matter how much time they've spent, because those things are assumed, right? These young ladies aren't feeling like blessed that this has happened. It's assumed that men will do that. And again, I don't think that they shouldn't. The problem is not that it's occurring. The problem is the incentive structure, which is that men are going to do this and then be broken up with very quickly and very readily as the solution to the problem. So men are going to invest all this time and this energy and money, and then they're going to get nothing for it because the woman is going to leave them or something like that, right? Okay. So a lot of people will hear me say this and then they'll be jumping to the conclusion that somehow I'm advocating that women shouldn't leave relationships they're unhappy in. That's not what I'm saying at all. Again, this is not prescriptive. This is simply analytical. I'm just describing the conditions which might be causing young men to abandon the dating game. And I think it's highly likely that these are the conditions that are causing it. So, what is done about this? That's not the point of this conversation. How society decides to address this problem, I'm not going to really talk about that. I'm simply going to talk about the conditions which are leading to the outcomes that we have. All right, so young men aren't looking for relationships. And it's probably the case that the incentive structures don't exist to cause them to search for the relationships. Um, so the question is, maybe what were the conditions that did lead young men to search and pursue and to chase relationships in the past? Or why were men willing to pay for everything before and now they're not? Is another way to describe this. Um, why were men willing to invest all of their time and energy into one woman? And what has changed that's causing more than half of Gen Z men to not even look for a relationship? And the answer is both culture and incentive structure. So I'm going to describe something that I don't see anyone talking about. I see a lot of dating advice and young people talking about this conversation, and I'll see a lot of words like high value being thrown around. Um, First of all, I want to get this out there right at the start. Um, High value implies that there is an average value. Okay. And I'm not going to disagree with that. All I'm going to say is, by definition, high value is not average. And by definition, most people are average. Okay. That's not an opinion. That's a matter of fact. That's the way it has to be. Right. So most people aren't high value. According to the definitions that are being used by these talk show hosts, right? That young people are watching. So that speaks to two things. It speaks to one, the men who are using the word high value as a self descriptor, like I'm not going to settle for less than this because I'm high value. Probably not. You're probably not high value. You're probably average value. You probably make average money. You're probably of average attraction level, and you're probably average morals, and you're probably average everything. That's what you should expect to be because that's what most people are by definition, right? There may be outliers, but I can tell you with certainty that in most ways, in most of my life, I've been pretty average. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with striving for the elevation of your potential. And there's nothing wrong with desiring the benefits which come with that. But I think it would be very presumptive and probably a little ignorant to assume that you deserve um, the benefits of being high value when it's very unlikely that you are. That's to the men. And for this conversation, I'm assuming a heteronormative relationship dynamic, a man and a woman in a dating scenario. So for everyone else, this conversation is basically moot. But for you gentlemen who are throwing around the term high value, it's highly unlikely that you are. Transversely, for the women who are expecting the behaviors of a high value man, it's highly unlikely that you are the kind of woman who could ask for them, because you're probably average also. And yeah, average people just should not have these bloated expectations for what their life is going to look like. It's so unrealistic to plan your life around what the top, 1% of people are going to be able to get away with. It just isn't. It isn't realistic. It's not likely that you're going to produce that outcome for yourself. So it would be best to make peace with the fact that you're most likely pretty average, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Most people are average. Most people should plan their lives around being average and what average expectations are and all of that. That's not only okay, it's actually good to make peace with that. Because then you can seek a partner accordingly, and you can get something that you can actually get. I think in our culture, um, there's been a sort of an awakening among men where they're realizing that in some ways the game is sort of rigged against them, where they're being held to these traditional expectations, but they're not getting the traditional rewards for it. And again, this is not prescriptive. I'm just making the observation. That's what it looks like. I'm not saying that anyone should do any particular thing about this. I'm simply trying to make sense of why young men aren't even looking for relationships. So there's been a value shift where men are saying, well, if the game's not fair, I'm not going to play it. Something like that. Um, I recall during I don't use dating websites anymore because I don't think they're effective and I don't think there's a very good result from them. I recall when I was on them, I would see a lot of dating websites, dating profiles of these young women who would have on their website, seeking a traditional dating dynamic. I think what young women today understand from that messaging is that a man would pay for most things, basically provide. Um, but it appeared to me to be the case that there may not have been as strong of an understanding of what that used to mean in terms of the dynamic. And I'm not going to single anybody out here. I'm going to talk about what relationships used to be like because I spoke to my grandparents. My grandparents are quite old. Um, my parents had me late, and their parents had them late. So for most people who might be watching this video, I'm talking about your great grandparents' era, realistically speaking. I was already in my 30s when my grandmother passed away, and she was 99. For perspective, I'm 36 now. So this is pretty much 100 years ago that I'm talking about. My grandmother got engaged when she was 14 and married when she was 15. And there was a much more traditional world alive back in those days. Okay. And something that's very important to understand about that world is that the well, first of all, the world was very different back then. My grandfather was a school bus driver in his early 20s, and he met my grandmother. He was the school bus driver, and she was on the bus, and she was maybe 14 years old. Okay. Again, nothing I'm going to talk about is prescriptive. This is all descriptive. I'm just going to tell you what happened and the way it was. No moral baggage or value assessment implied. And he met my grandmother on that bus. Within about 2 years of meeting her, he proposed to her. They became engaged when she was 15, and they were married by the time she was 16. He was in his early 20s. He had a very, very hard life. Life was very hard for my grandfather, but he made it work. He worked really hard to make it work. I guess I should just tell you the whole story. So my great-grandfather Gus immigrated from Prussia in the late 1800s. And the reason he left Prussia was because, well, we all know our European history loves a good Protestant Catholic struggle. He was involved in that in Prussia. If you don't know what Prussia is, it's the empire that predated Germany. And he was engaged in the Protestant Catholic divide. And what he was running around doing over there in Prussia that made him very unpopular was he was actually burning down Catholic churches. Kind of unbelievable to think, but that's what he did. We're not really sure how many churches he burned down. We believe it was more than one, though. And so he made a habit of burning down Catholic churches, which is kind of unbelievable to think about, but in modern thought. But that's what he was up to. So he had to flee the country because he was being hunted. They were going to solve this problem of him burning down their churches. So he left the country. And he went to Nebraska. And he was such a pain in the ass in Nebraska that they tarred and feathered him. And he survived. And then he had to flee Nebraska, and he went to Eastern Washington, where he settled down. And he's kind of an asshole, and his wife was mentally unwell, so she was in and out of institutions. Although back in those days, a husband could put his wife in an institution against her will. So that's not so fun if you're married to a kind of a wild man, a dangerous wild man. That being said, mental illness does run in that side of the family a little bit. So it is possible that she was legitimately unwell. But from my perspective, it's hard to say. I don't know if she was really unwell or not, or if he was just being an abusive POS, so to speak. I'm not going to disparage my great-grandfather's name without knowing it, but I'm just making it clear that the question exists. I don't actually know if he was treating her well or not. But I do know that he treated other people unwell, so do with that information as you will. And one of those people he treated not so well was my grandfather. My grandfather, when he was 14 or so, 15, I don't know, 13 maybe even, was made to live in the barn. Oh, I skipped a very important part. So my great-grandmother was probably mentally unwell. The reason I upgraded that to probably is because the solution that she sought out was to bring my grandfather and his brother to a hay bale, which she soaked in gasoline and tied herself to as well. And she lit it on fire, and by some miracle, my grandfather escaped, and so did his brother. But my great-grandmother did not, and she was actually burned to death at the hay bale. So to use internet language, she unalived herself. And it's one of the great tragedies of my family history. So there's a lot of fire in my family history, which coincidentally, my astrological chart also has a lot of fire in it. Not to sound woo-woo and hippie, but it does. Maybe that's why I like cigars. So Grandpa survived, but when my great-grandpa remarried, he exiled my father to the barn. He wasn't allowed to live in the house anymore. And my great-grandfather had a new family, and my grandfather was raised outside of the house in the barn. And he was made to work. And he worked and he worked. As a shoe cobbler. So he's working in shoes, and he's making shoes. He wasn't making much money, but my great-grandfather took all of the money he was making. Until eventually he wore a hole through his shoes. His feet were touching the ground, and obviously in eastern Washington where it snows, that's not a tenable solution. So one week he bought himself a new pair of shoes with the money he made himself a new pair of shoes, bought it, I'm not sure, but he got a new pair of shoes. And when he got home, my great-grandfather was so upset by this, by the fact that the money didn't come that week or that month. I'm not sure about some of these details, but the general story is the same. That he kicked him out of the house. Keep in mind, my grandfather might have been 15 at this time. Kicked him out of the house. And when I say kicked him out of the house, I mean kicked him out of the barn because he wasn't living in the house. And he knew that if he disowned him and wrote him out of the will, that he would be responsible for some amount of money. So instead of writing him out of the will, he left my grandfather 1 penny in the will so that he wouldn't have to pay the penalties of um, taking him out of the will. And so my grandfather received 1 penny from his dad, who was um, not even letting him live in the house, and that was his inheritance. So my grandfather literally came from one of the most traumatic upbringings, and absolutely no money, total abject poverty. And from there, he bought the school bus and started a life for himself. He wound up buying farmland and took out a really risky loan to buy more, which by some miracle, there was a wonderful harvest that year. Buying farmland is risky because if your first crop goes bad, you can't pay the loan and you lose everything. So he attributed that success to God, found the church, and became a very religious and a very decent man. Um, he was always a very stern man. Like I said, he had a hard life. His mother, who was probably mentally unwell, dropped him when he was a child and broke his back. Like, he went through a lot. So the fact that he was able to do this is amazing. And I only tell you that whole story to say this is a man who came from absolutely nothing and built a life for himself out of pure force of will, and wound up having a very successful career. He was able to provide for his family. And I'm not sure that he would have done what he did if he didn't think that he could have a family that he would take care of. Um, I can't really imagine any man sacrificing that much and struggling that much if he didn't have kids, if he didn't have a family to provide for, if he didn't have some greater meaning that was bigger than his own pleasures. I just don't think you would put yourself through all of that. Um, I know that I'm not as great of a man as my grandfather was. Um, I don't think that I would have been able to survive what he went through, frankly. He's a source of great inspiration for me. And the fact that he went through such hardships and still created a wonderful family that he took care of, who all respected him until the day that he died in his 70s of cancer, and had a wife, and my grandmother who never said a bad word about him, all the way until her death at the age of 99 and 3/4. She never said a bad word about him. She respected him for her entire life. And this is a relationship dynamic which would be legally impossible today. Um, was victimless in the truest sense. They loved each other deeply and cared for each other until the end. Not a dynamic I'm advocating for. I would never choose a partner that young, nor do I think anybody should, but this was common in those days. It was a different time. So, again, I'm not giving you a prescription here. I'm simply giving you a description. This is real history. This is the real history that this is the real history of my family. So, um, great. So, how does that relate to what we were talking about? So, the reason I told you all of that was simply to elucidate a traditional relationship in the truest sense. Traditional people doing traditional things. And why was that relationship able to be successful? Um, because there were conditions that existed then that simply do not exist now. I wonder if I could get this match going with the embers in the center of this cigar. We'll see. Um, the relationship dynamic was so unrelatable to us now that I can't imagine anybody relating to it or sympathizing with it. Even I myself, who know the outcome of this, cannot relate to it. I can't imagine doing what he did, and yet it worked. And the reason I can't imagine it is because the world I grew up in is so radically different. I grew up in a pretty large city in the East Bay of California. Um, and basically everyone I knew at my school was a complete stranger. Um, I didn't know the family members of anybody at my school. I didn't know their circumstances. Everybody that I knew, I had to get to know from scratch. What I'm getting at here is everybody I knew was a stranger until I broke through the initial barrier. This means all of the girls that I dated in high school were strangers to me until we started dating, and then we got to know each other. And that is fundamentally different from the world that my grandfather grew up in. My grandfather knew my grandmother's parents. He knew their family. Everybody in that town knew each other. And that is a dynamic which does not exist for the majority of people. The majority of people now, either their grandparents or their parents moved to a major city before they were born. They were born in a large city. So population density is something that we do not have in common. You don't have in common with your great grandparents. I didn't have this in common with my grandparents. They grew up in a small town where before they started dating, they already knew that this family has a set of values which I agree in, which I believe in. And because of that, when they started dating, that was part of the implicit dating agreement. Okay. I'm pursuing this girl because I like the family values that she has. And I would want this for my family. And this was a piece of the traditional dating pie, which is completely gone for the vast majority of people. The supermajority of young men are in a dating market where they do not know the girl or the parents of the girl that they're pursuing. They only know whether they're attracted to her or not, or whether whatever they wrote in their dating profile aligns. And dating profiles generally have character limits, so you can't even write an essay, and even if you could, you don't necessarily know that the living style is going to cohere. There's just so many things that you don't see in these dating website profiles, which you do see if you know someone over years in a small town. On the other side of the coin, my grandmother's parents knew my grandfather. They knew who he was, they knew what he went through. They knew that he was fundamentally a good man despite the fact that his upbringing was really hard. And because of this, when my grandfather approached my grandmother and sought their approval, because people did that back then, they sought the approval of the parents. They agreed that he was a good man who would treat my grandmother well, and they gave their approval. And that's part of the reason why my grandmother was able to trust her parents and marry my grandfather, despite an approximately 7-year age gap in what would be an unimaginable relationship today, which lasted a whole lifetime of love and commitment. See, nowadays young people aren't even interested in the opinions of their parents. Again, I'm not saying they should be. I'm saying that all of the conditions were different back then. There is fundamentally almost nothing in common with the dating landscape that young people have today with the one that their great grandparents had. And so when I see on a dating website um, a young woman asking for traditional dating values, it's kind of laughable because I'm thinking, how could you ask for that? The conditions which facilitated that agreement don't exist anymore for the supermajority of people. There are some people in small towns who could probably still do this today. But most people don't live in those circumstances. Most people live in big cities, and the big cities are where I'm seeing these dating profiles, right? Or I should say was, because I don't use them anymore. And this is a major problem. Not only that, but if you look at college success rates, women in Gen Z are significantly outperforming Gen Z men in terms of college attendance and success rates. Women are not only applying to universities more often, they're getting accepted more often, and they're producing better grades than Gen Z men. And so, what this means for the most part is that women are actually coming out of college more successful and often terms earning more money on average than their Gen Z male counterparts. And if women are expecting traditional values, that means that they're expecting these men to pay for everything, even though the women are making more money and have a better career trajectory ahead of them. And so, in order for this to be the case, these young women would have to successfully net one of the few men who attended a university who's going to have a career that makes more money than them. It's extremely unlikely because those young men are basically being chased by all of the women who went to these colleges. And that means that at an increasingly drastic rate, women are competing for a tiny, increasingly small percentage of men. That's where I'm going with this. And that means that this small pool of men have an increasingly large amount of options, an increasingly gigantic dating pool to choose from. And the standards and expectations of the young women have never been higher. And this imbalance is causing most of these young men who understand the incentive structure to just quit. They're just saying, well, then I'm not going to date at all. And what they're doing instead is they're probably gaming, playing games online. I think that's probably what most of them are doing, actually. They're probably playing video games. And while I don't think that that's the right answer, it's very hard to say that they're wrong for doing that, understanding the context of everything that I just described, because they don't know these women. They don't know them. They don't know their families. They don't know their moral sets. And they have to pay money that they really don't have because cost of living has never been higher to get to know these women. And that has never been the case. It has never been the case that you have to pay money to get to know a complete stranger. And then you still get rejected. Again, I'm not saying women owe these men anything. I'm not saying that women should settle for a guy that, once they date them, they find out that they don't really like them. But I do think it's the case that it's a very unreasonable thing to expect a young man to pay to get to know you. Excuse me. I think that that is a very unrealistic expectation. And that is part of the equation that I'm talking about. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Which is the incentive structure doesn't make sense for young men to participate in the modern dating pool where they're being expected to uphold traditional values. For women they don't know, and the solution to relationships that aren't working is to break up. Young men are not stupid. So they know this, and that's why they're not dating. And so young women are asking the question, where have all the good men gone? And the answer is that the proverbial juice isn't worth the squeeze. Young men aren't going to pay a lot of money that they don't have to get to know women who are going to ghost them if anything goes wrong. Again, I don't think that I have the solution to this problem. I'm not telling anybody what they should do with this information. I simply think that by analyzing this problem in a way that I haven't seen presented, outside of the red pill, high value dichotomy, which has become so cliche and boring. And most of the solutions that I see being proposed by those guys are absolutely horrible and corrosive to culture and will not produce powerful nuclear family dynamics. But the problem is that if both young men and young women are not necessarily prioritizing the creation of children, and you have a heavily weighted system which doesn't benefit young men in any way, um, how do you convince them to participate in the game that they know is basically a losing situation? And in my opinion, this is probably the greatest question which Gen Z has to find the answer to. Um, they're not going to find it on TikTok. They're not finding it currently on YouTube. And I don't see any end in sight to this problem. But this is one of the problems of our generation, of our era. The millennials have a lot of these problems in place, and Gen Z has them in an even greater proportion. And I don't know what to do about it, but I think the first step is to identify the problem. I can't remember which philosopher it was, but one of the philosophers in history. Perhaps it was an author. Authors are usually philosophers incognito, but basically they said that once you've figured out what the problem is, you're halfway there. That is to say that identifying the problem is the majority of the problem itself. The majority of the solution is to figure out what the problem is. And I think that the problem that we have is that people want something that is dead. It's gone. That idea that you're going to date in this way and find what our great grandparents or my grandparents had is not realistic. The incentive structure doesn't exist, and the base modality of living is not there for most people. And you cannot expect men to engage um, in a payment program to get to know women. They're not going to do it. And so the proposition is, how do we solve this problem as a people? And with that, I have run out of cigar, and I also think that that's a good cliffhanger to end on because, like I said when I started, I don't know what the answer to this problem is, but I think that that is the problem. And what I would like to do is to um, ask for the audience to think about that problem and perhaps even propose solutions. I don't think it's likely that any one person is going to come up with the answer to this. If you feel like you have an answer, feel free to drop it in the comments. I will likely neither affirm or deny what I think the solution is. And the reason for that is because, one, the culture is so divided on this question that a lot of people are very angry about the phenomenon and they're experiencing the negative consequences of it. So a lot of people are very upset about this. And two, I just literally don't think that I'm smart enough to solve a problem this big at a societal level. I think it would be more beneficial for people to create theories and try to solve the problem in their life, in their own life. I do think that it will probably involve a lot of communication and it will likely take years and years and years to solve this problem. I think an optimistic outlook is a 20-year range if it ever gets solved. I think a pessimistic outcome is that it will destroy birth rates permanently and could lead to the eventual collapse of a nation, so to speak. So I do think it's that kind of problem. Even more dramatically, I see this problem in basically every country all at the same time. Korea has plummeting birth rates. Japan has plummeting birth rates. All of Europe has plummeting birth rates. The United States have plummeting birth rates. Basically, all Western nations are going through this problem at the same time. And it appears to be the calamity of the modern age. Like I'm telling you, I think it's top 5 problems of our era. Probably closer to the number one problem because when you don't have children, there's a major piece of human purpose and meaning that's missing that causes people to justify their existence, to struggle through hard times, and people just don't have it. So they're replacing it with things like pleasure and happiness and pleasure are not a good substitute for a profound sense of meaning which see you through struggles and hardships. And so, um, with that, I would implore you, the viewer, to think about the problem. And if you feel so inclined, drop a comment saying what your solution is. I think it's going to take basically all minds working on this problem to solve it. And I wish you a wonderful evening and a beautiful night. I would encourage you to, if you don't believe in the prospect of having children, I would encourage you to question what life would be like in your elder years and how you can find meaning without them. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it seems very improbable that the suffering of life could be carried without having a child. And if you have any creative ideas on the solution, yeah, like I said, drop a comment. If you enjoyed this video, if it was thought provoking to you, please click like, please subscribe, and I'll be uploading videos on a regular cadence. So I wish you peace and blessings and happiness and joy in your life, and the kind of meaning that sustains you through hardships. And hopefully, we can overcome some of these problems together. Thank you so much. Have a lovely night. Bye bye.